Good evening. Certainly wonderful to see you here this evening. Glad that you have chosen to be here. And I know I say that quite often, but I want you to know that I truly mean it. I don't just say it to fill words while I'm trying to get my thoughts together to start a lesson. No, I am truly glad that you are here. It means a lot to me. It means even more to the Lord that you have chosen to be here tonight, assembled with the saints. If you have your Bibles, I pray that you do. Be opening up to James chapter number 1. James chapter number 1. We've been looking at a series of lessons from the book of James. We're fairly recent into this particular series of lessons. Tonight, our lesson brings us to James chapter 1 and verse number 12. That's all we'll be getting through this evening, just one verse. But it is a verse that is worthy of our consideration. You know, a lot of times in Scripture, we come across this word, blessed. It's a word that we see that we're most familiar with, at least, there in Matthew chapter 5, starting there in verse number 1 through about verse number 12 as the Sermon on the Mount. As Jesus starts that particular sermon, he starts with what we know as the Beatitudes. And so there are Beatitudes statements there. There are blessed statements there. Another not as familiar set of passages, but in the book of Revelation, there are 7 verses throughout the book that have this idea of being blessed in certain situations. And then probably maybe a more familiar one there in Psalm number 1 and verse number 1, the psalmist starts out with this concept of being blessed. And in every single one of those instances, from Matthew chapter 5 to every time that it's found within the book of Revelation, to even there in Psalm 1 and verse 1, that word blessed, as you probably already well know, can be translated happy or can be translated happiness. And so another such statement is found here in James chapter 1 and verse number 12. There the text reads, "Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life which the Lord hath promised to them that love him." Blessed is the man that endureth temptation. Blessed is the man, or happy is the man that endureth temptation. You know, some of the things that we have looked at in James to this point, some of them have been, that's kind of hard, right? You think about what James says as he opens up this book there in verse number 2 of chapter 1. "Count it all joy, my brethren, when you fall in the various trials, various temptations, various testings of your faith." That's what James is talking about here in verse 12, just 10 verses later. Blessed is the man that endureth temptations. Blessed is the man that gets through testings. You know, when we think about testings in the Bible, there's certainly one man, or at least one man that comes to my mind that was certainly tested. That was a man by the name of Abraham. Remember, Abraham, he was living there in Haran with his kin folks, and God tells him, he says, "Abram, you need to get up. You need to get out of thy father's house, get out of this country, go to a land in which I will show you." And Abraham, without hesitation, moved his family. That was a testing. Years later, as Abraham is now an older individual, him and his wife is barren, God tells Abraham that, "Abraham, you are going to have a son." And we remember Sarah, she laughed at this, but that too was a testing of Abraham's faith. But probably one of the most well-known ones that we remember as far as Abraham is concerned happens there in Genesis chapter number 22. After that son which was promised has been born, here is Isaac, and God tells Abraham there in Genesis chapter number 22, "You need to take your son, your only son Isaac, and you need to take him over here to Mount Moriah, a 3 days journey." And Abraham, you are going to sacrifice him. That was a test that Abraham had to go through. Temptations, trials, things that happen within our lives. So this evening we're going to look at really 4 things from this verse here in number 12. If you're taking notes, we're going to be looking firstly at blessed is the man that endures temptation. Secondly, we'll be looking at blessed is the man who is tried. Thirdly, we'll be looking at the man, blessed is the man that receives. And fourthly, we'll be looking at blessed is the man who loves the Lord. And so those will be the 4 things that we consider together this evening. Let's consider this first one then. Blessed is the man that endures temptations. We already talked about this in our introduction, but happy is the man that endures these temptations, and endures these testings, these trials, these hardships. You know, sometimes when we think about this idea of a testing, or we think about this idea of a trial, we need to think about it that there's really 2 aspects to it, right? Because first of all, there can be temptations, there can be trials that we face on an inward basis. In other words, I'm talking about things that we battle within our mind, maybe improper thoughts, maybe becoming discouraged. There are things that we have to deal with, that we have to overcome, that are inward. And sometimes those are hard, because those are the ones that are really hitting us, because from the outside, an individual may look like they're perfectly fine. But maybe on the inside, they're really struggling with things. And so we have to understand that we have to overcome those things, but also remember that this temptation, this testing, it certainly carries the idea, it certainly carries the thought of overcoming those outward hardships, those outward trials. But you know, something that is, you almost miss it in the English. But notice James, he says, blessed is the man that the King James renders this word endureth. Now, I didn't really look at some of the other translations. Maybe I should have. If I remember correctly, I think the New King James may translate that word endures. The endureth, though, and you know, some people get bent out of shape over the King James because it puts those little THs on the end of words. Well, that's not there just because that was the language of the day, but it helps better convey the Greek meaning. And so really what James is saying here, and he's trying to express this, like I said, it's almost lost in the English, but he's saying, blessed is the man that doesn't just endure one temptation, but it's the idea of blessed is the man, or happy is in the man, that as these trials come, as these temptations come, he continues to overcome those things. He continues to be patient with those things. This is an individual that is under these temptations, that is under these testings, and he continues to overcome. It's the same man in verse number 2 that continues to find joy in those things. It's that same individual that in verse number 4 and in verse number 5, when he goes through those temptations, when he goes through those trials, that he understands that he has a rock in which he can count on. He has the strength from the Lord. Now, you know, so he's saying here, blessed is the man, happy is the man that endureth, that continues to endure these testings, that continues to have patience during these trials. One commentator said, one individual that continues to bear up under whatever trial he's going through. to continually be able to rely on God. Consider a few passages with me as we consider this idea of continuing to endure trials, to continually endure hardship, and how that may be able to bring about happiness. If you're here in James, go one book over to the book of 1 Peter. I want to show you something that Peter says that should bring comfort to us in times of this, in times of trials, when we're going through these things. Notice what Peter says there in 1 Peter chapter 5, specifically there in verse number 7. He says, casting all your cares upon him. Why? For he careth for you. So you and I, as children of God, when the trials of life, the temptations of life, the testings of life are bearing down upon us, remember, sometimes it's even those inward testings, those inward struggles that maybe we're not letting our brothers and sisters in Christ know that we're going through, and we should let them know that we're struggling with those things. But in reality, sometimes we have those things that we bottle up that we don't want to tell anybody about. But Peter says you can cast all your cares, you can cast all your trials, you can cast all your hardships upon the Lord, because don't miss this point, because he cares for you. You know, sometimes we can get on our own minds, right? We can get in our own heads. We have things that are maybe going on in our life, and we just think, well, man, it just seems like the world is out to get me. It just seems that everything around me is falling apart. It seems like nothing is going my way. Well, we need to remember the Lord cares for us. James is able to write that you can find joy in trials. James is able to write that you can find happiness as you're enduring, as you're overcoming these testings of life. And one of the reasons that we can find happiness is, despite all these things that are going on, there is still God, and God still cares for me. These things that are going on in my life, God still cares for me. You're, of course, familiar with this passage. It's one that we've used before, but turn over to the book of 1 Corinthians. It's a favorite passage of mine, just because of the assurance that it offers, right? We, of course, know there in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse number 12, Paul says, take heed, he that stands, lest he fall. But there in verse number 13, he says, there hath no temptation taken you, but such is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above what you are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape it, that ye may be able to bear it. And so just more evidence, right? James saying you can be happy when you're going through these testings, as you're enduring these testings. One, because the Lord cares for you. Two, the Lord has made a way for you to escape it. In other words, the Lord has made a way for you to overcome it. You know, we have to remember that. Because again, sometimes we get in our own head, we get to thinking about the things that are pressing down upon us. And sometimes we get to thinking, well, there's no way out. That's an incorrect line of thinking. Because there is a way out. The inspired apostle Paul writes here that God has made the way out. One of those ways is casting those cares upon him. But, you know, I think about something the psalmist would say. Turn back in your Old Testament to Psalm 18. And I want you to notice something specifically that we find in Psalm 18. And I want us to consider together just verse number 2. Psalm 18, verse number 2, there's really a lot of things that you could look at in Psalm 18, but specifically verse number 2. In verse number 1, he even makes mention of the fact that the Lord is his strength. But notice what the psalmist attributes to the Lord in Psalm 18 in verse number 2. He says, "The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust, my buckler and the horn of my salvation and my high tower." In other words, when we have all these things that are pressing down upon us, whether it be sorrow, sickness, pain, disappointment, maybe disappointment in friends, disappointment in family, hardship, grief, sometimes just the everyday stresses of life. When all these things are pressing down upon us, these testings are pressing down upon us, James says you can find happiness in overcoming those things. And one of the best things that we can do is turn to our God, who, as the psalmist said, should be our rock, who should be our fortress, our deliverer, and all those wonderful things that is described there in Psalm 18 and verse number 2. Happy is the man that endures temptation. But you go back there to James chapter 1. You continue looking and examining at what James goes on to say there in verse number 12 when he says, "Blessed is the man that endureth," that continues to endure temptations. And then he makes this statement, "For when he is tried." And that's our next point. Blessed is the man who is tried. Now, this idea here of this man that is tried, it really carries the idea of one that is approved, or one that passes the test. And so James here is saying, happy is the man that endures a test, who when approved, or when passes the test. We can always probably think back to a time when we were in school, right? Some of us, we can get there a lot quicker than others. But we can remember times when we were in school, and maybe we can remember a test, right? Maybe a test that maybe we didn't study for, maybe the best that we should have. And then you get to taking that test and you're thinking, man, this isn't going to be good. And then you have to maybe go before the teacher and explain why you did so poorly on that test. Maybe you have to go before mom and dad and explain why you did so poorly on that test, right? Because you didn't overcome. You weren't prepared. But James isn't talking about that. He's talking about the man who is approved. He's talking about the man that overcame the test. We used Abraham as an illustration earlier. If we go back to those illustrations of Abraham, he passed those tests to at least a certain degree, right? I say that because Abraham was told, well, here, I'll show you what I mean by it. Go to Genesis chapter number 12 really quickly. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this. This is not even really part of our lesson, but I want to show you what I mean when I say that Abraham pretty much passed the test, but he had some questions that he missed, if you want to use that illustration. But if you go to Genesis chapter 12 and you look at verse number 1, we understand that this is where God is telling Abraham that he needs to get out. But really, if you look at the language that's used in verse number 12, it says, "Now the Lord had said unto Abraham." In other words, what we're seeing here in verse number 12 is a reminder. Abraham, you have already been told you need to get out, you need to leave. And so Abraham, the Lord hath said unto you, the Lord had said, past tense, remember, you need to get up and you need to go. And so Abraham, he's reminded, he gets up and he goes. because he leaves where he was in the Ur of Chaldees. You can look up to verse number 31. You see Terah, he takes Abraham, and they leave the Ur of Chaldees, they leave the Ur of Chaldees. I'll get it together here in a minute. And they come to Haran, and they dwelt there. But that's not where they were supposed to go. Where were they supposed to go? I mean, if you read verse 31 of chapter 11, you read the entirety of the verse. Now Terah took Abraham his son, and Lot the son of Haran his sons, and Sarai daughter-in-law, and his son Abraham's wife, and they went forth with them from the Ur of Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. See, they left the Ur of Chaldees. They were going to the land of Canaan like they were supposed to, but they come to the land of Haran, and what did they do? They stopped and they dwelt there. Was that where they were supposed to dwell? No. Where were they supposed to go? They were supposed to go to the land of Chaldea. So you get to, not the land of Chaldea, they're supposed to go to Canaan. You get to chapter 12, and God has to remind Abraham, you need to get up. You need to get out of here. You need to get out of your father's house, and you need to go to that land. You can't stay here, Abraham. Now we know at this point, Abraham does. He gets his wife, he gets his family, he leaves his father, and he does go. But it took him a minute to get there. You know what happens when he's promised a child, right? And this is part of growing in your faith. When he's promised that one and only son, Isaac, him and Sarah, they get a little bit impatient, and they're thinking, in our old age, we're never going to have children. So here, let's insert Hagar into the equation, and you can have a child that way. Well, they have a child that way, but that was not God's plan. Now, eventually, Abraham and Sarah do have a child, and so he passes the test, but it took him a little bit to get there. But it's finally with that third and final test, right? In Genesis chapter 22, where God tells Abraham, hey, you go and do this. And what does Abraham do? He goes and does it. He is approved of that test. You know, it's the same language that Paul would write to Timothy there in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse number 15. Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman needed not to be ashamed, handling aright the word of God, approved. I always illustrate it this way when talking about that particular verse. Imagine you being an electrician or being a contractor, and you go to build a building. Well, when you go to build a building, when you go to install electric in a building, can you just do it any old way you want? No, there's code. Your building has to be up to code. Now, there are some older buildings that were built before codes really became a thing, and they kind of grandfathered those buildings in. But if they were ever to redo those buildings, guess what? They'd have to make sure the building was up to code. Well, you could imagine an electrician, he decides to ignore the electric code, and so when that inspector comes in, he's not going to pass, because he didn't do those things correctly. Well, James is talking about blessed is the man who, when he is tried or when he is approved. Go over to 1 Peter chapter 4. We see a illustration. Peter gives us a biblical illustration of this word in 1 Peter chapter number 4. Look there at, let's pick up reading in verse number 12. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse number 12. Beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial, which is to try you, as though some strange thing has happened unto you. But rejoice insomuch as ye are partakers of Christ, suffering, that when his glory shall be revealed, you may be glad also with exceedingly joy. That's not the exact verse that I was looking for, but the idea there of overcoming the fiery trial, that works there. The verse I was looking for, Peter talks about our faith being tried through fire, the impurities, but that fiery trial, it works there because it's the same idea, the fiery trial. But gold, when they want to get it pure, they heat it up. They heat it up to a point that the gold becomes liquid. And what happens then, all the impurities that are in that gold floats to the top, the pure gold sinks to the bottom, and then they can take and they can skim those impurities off. The idea of a fiery trial there. That's the idea of being approved. You're going through a trial. You're going through a testing. And when you come out on the better side, on the other side, you're better for it. Peter says that this fiery trial, but notice the fiery trial, this passage will work for the illustration that we're wanting to point. You look there in verse number 13, he says, insomuch you are partakers of Christ's suffering. We're partakers of trials. We're partakers of hardships. And sometimes those things are fiery trials. And they make us stronger. And we can overcome. We can pass the test. Go back to James. James chapter number 1. In verse number 12, he says, blessed or happy is the man who continues to endure these temptations or these testings. For when he is tried or when he is approved, notice this, he shall receive the crown of life which the Lord hath promised. So our next point then becomes, blessed is the man that receives. You look at the context of what James is talking about. You can be happy when you overcome these trials, when you endure these trials, because in doing so, what are you going to get? You're going to receive a crown of life. You talk about happy moments. I'm sure each of us can think about moments in our life where maybe we received something. Maybe you were in a job and you received a reward for being the best at your job. Maybe when you were in school, you think about when you graduated high school, right? You received that degree. How happy were you? When you went to college, if you went to college and you received that degree, how happy were you? On your wedding day, when you got to marry your spouse, how happy were you? We can think about moments in our life where happiness reigned. When your first child was born, how happy were you? When your second child was born, maybe how happy were you? Sometimes that you get to that third child and you cry a little bit. No, I'm just kidding. But we think about moments in our life when we're happy. But you can't even imagine, right? How, we sing that song, right? There's a great day coming, a great day coming. How happy will you be when you hear those words, well done, thy good and faithful servant? I don't believe that anything on this earth you've experienced will compare to that moment. And that's what James is talking about. James is saying, listen, I understand that there's hardships. I understand that there's testings. I understand that there's trials. James here would have endured some of those trials. No doubt James would have experienced some of the same hardships that you and I are going through. But to be able to endure those things, to be able to overcome those things, and to hear, well done, thy good and faithful servant, enter into thy rest, there's nothing better. It's the same thing that Jesus makes mention of there in Revelation chapter 2 and verse number 10. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. Overcome the small things that happen in this life. So someone may make fun of you. So someone may scold you. So someone may take your physical life. In the grand scheme of things, if you've been faithful to the Lord, what does it matter? I think about Paul, who would write, we would say it this way, I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place. He says, I want to stay here and I want to be with my brethren and I want to do the work of the church. He says, man, I long to go on and be with the Lord. To hear those words. To enter into a place, as the book of Revelation describes, as a place of no sorrows, those things that we described earlier as those temptations, the pain, the sorrows, the disappointment, stress. To be in a place where there is no more pain, there is no more sorrow, there is no more disappointment, there is no more stress. How wonderful that will be. And to say that blessed is the man that receives that, that's an understatement, right? Happy, joyful is the man that gets to receive that crown of life. Paul would call it a crown of righteousness in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse number 8. Peter would go on to call it a crown of glory. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse number 4. Happy is the man that received these things. And understand, he receives these things because he overcame. But also don't miss this little point, and I don't want to brush over it. But it's the crown of life which the Lord hath promised. Now when God makes a promise, you can count on it. It is the case that sometimes here upon this earth, men make promises that sometimes they don't keep. Sometimes men will make promises, individuals will make promises that sadly they never intend to keep. That's a reality. Sometimes people make promises that they're not able to keep, maybe because of sickness, maybe because of death or something like that. The reality is when a man makes a promise, it's not always a guarantee. But when God makes a promise, you don't have to worry about God going back on his word. You don't have to worry about God running out of time before he can make that promise. You don't have to worry about God dying before he can fulfill that promise. You don't have to worry about God making a promise out of deception. And so we can be happy in the fact when we overcome these trials and we can overcome these hardships because there is that crown of life awaiting, that crown of life that God promised to give us. But notice that brings us to our last point because he says, promised to them that love him. So that really brings us to our final point. Blessed or happy is the man that loves the Lord. As I got to thinking about how I wanted to approach this final point, I thought, let's go over to John chapter 14 and verse 15, John chapter 15, verse 14. Those are good verses, but I feel sometimes we kind of beat those verses into the ground. They're good verses. Write them down in your notes. But then I really got to thinking about this statement in lieu of the whole verse. The entire verse is based upon these 5 words. To them that love him. Now think about it. If I do not love God, am I going to properly endure temptations? No. If I do not love God, I will never properly endure temptations. If I don't properly endure temptations, then guess what? I can never pass the test. I can never be approved of the test. If I don't love God, I'll never properly endure the temptations. I can never properly be approved of the test. And therefore, I will never qualify for the crown of life. And so we started this sermon, and rightfully so, talking about blessed is the man that endures the temptation. And we sometimes look at the verse that when I endure temptation, then all these other things follow. But in reality, when you look at it, all these things are built upon, do I love God? That's a question that each individual has to ask himself. Do I love God? Now, in the beginning of the verse, we talked about the individual that endureth, continues to endure this ongoing process of overcoming temptations. We understand the love down here for God. It's the same thing. It's the idea that I came to love God at a point in the past, and I'm going to continue to love him into present time and, Lord willing, into the future. It's not just I loved him at one time and obeyed him at one time, and then I stopped, and then I continued to receive all the blessings of the Lord. That's not how it works. That's once saved, always saved doctrine. But it's the idea that I love God. And because I love God, I'm going to properly endure all those. You talk about enduring some things, right? For just a moment, we're going to draw this lesson to a close here in just a minute. But, one of the things that I think, at least in my mind, that illustrates true love for God. You remember Jesus, right? After he had resurrected, you remember the Jews were so concerned about his resurrection because of what Jesus said that he was going to do. You remember they went to Pilate and they said, this guy Jesus was talking about how he was going to come back from the dead. And, we're worried that his apostles are going to break in there and steal his body. So we need to put a Roman guard on this tomb. And Pilate says, okay. And so they put a Roman guard on this tomb and they seal the tomb. And Jesus resurrects anyway, because that's not going to stop him. So he gets up the third day anyway. And so the Jews, they said, well, we can't explain it, so we're just going to have to pay the Roman guard off and have the Roman guard say that they fell asleep. And so I bring all that up because you talk about love for God. And so the Jews, they were afraid of what the apostles might do for Jesus. But what I want to just take a moment to discuss is what the apostles actually did for Jesus. Now, if secular history be true, if what we can find in secular history, all the apostles died a martyr's death save John. And some of the deaths that they died, they didn't just, someone didn't just walk up and just, I don't know, think about it a quick, some of these deaths were slow. Some of these deaths were painful. You think about if secular history to be true, they were going to crucify Peter, and he objected to dying the same way that the Lord did, and so they crucified him upside down. And they talked about, some of these guys being cut in half and beheaded and all these things. Now, these individuals, that's the love that they had for God, that they were willing to die for him. Now that's love. Think about it. God loved you so much. What did he do? He sent his son to this earth. Jesus loved you so much. What did he do? He went to the cross for you. I love God so much, I should be willing, if necessary, to give my life for him. You look at someone that is not willing to give their life for Christ, you have someone that doesn't truly love God. You look at someone, as James is talking about here, who is not willing to endure temptations, who's not willing to overcome these tryings. You're talking about someone who does not truly love God. And so as we close our lesson this evening, I really have two questions for you. Number one, do you love God? And number two, if you truly do love God, overcome the things that you're going through. Will you overcome them this evening? If you're here and you're not a child of God, overcome that hurdle and become one. If you are here this evening and you are a child of God, but you're struggling with anything, overcome that hurdle and come back home. Maybe you're just here this evening and maybe you're struggling with something physically. You know, sometimes we offer the Lord's invitation and we focus only on the spiritually. Don't misunderstand me. That is the not the sole purpose. That is the main purpose, because we want to talk about people's spirituality. But, you know, sometimes we just need physical help. You know, the congregation can help you with that as well. You don't necessarily have to respond to the invitation, but let us know. Let us help you endure. Let us bear one another's burdens in love. Let us cast those cares upon the Lord, because he cares for us. And so if you are here this evening and you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, we encourage you to do so as together we stand and we sing.